All right, so thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name's Kirsty. I'm the community coaching lead at Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So as some of you guys already know, we've been hosting these coach socialization series for about, I think this is our 4th week now, on a variety of topics. And essentially we started this so that we could create a platform for coaches to connect during this time of isolation and to learn from each other and to learn from professionals on a variety of topics. So tonight we have DeRoo with us to talk about self-talk. And she is a mental performance consultant with the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So I'll let Tina take it on from here. But if you do want to participate in this session, you can turn your mic on and your video on, or you can use the chat box, whatever you prefer. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Kirsty. So yes, my name is Tina. I work at the Sports Centre. I work with a whole range of sports, and mostly at the provincial level at this point. But I want to get to know you guys a little bit better. You are all new to me, as far as I can tell by either your names or your video. So I'm going to I think this will work well. I've got something called Mentee Meter. So you're going to I'm going to share screen, and you guys are going to just open up your phone, and you can go to mentee.com. So hopefully you can see that on the screen, and use this code at the top. So it's 193266. And this is the first question. There's a few sort of little kind of icebreaker, kind of intro questions that I have for you guys. So have you attended one of these already? So once you guys put your answers in, they just sort of show up right away. And there's only like 4 of you answering, so it shouldn't take, or I don't know if Kirsty, if you're gonna log on and answer these ones as well. So there might just be, well, mostly we've got first time, and maybe we're waiting on one more. Okay, so we've got the split group, some who've been to a few, some who this is their first one, so that's great. Okay, so the next question then is, if you've been to these, then what's been most helpful for you from the previous sessions? Like what have you been getting out of these? And if you're brand new to these, what would be the most helpful to you? This is gonna sort of help guide this little half-hour session, so that I can make sure that you get as much value out of this as possible. So you can type in an answer. This turns into a word cloud. So if people type in the same answer, then that word gets bigger. And you can put in multiple words. So you can sort of keep putting in other words for whatever would be helpful to you. And we can sort of see as a group what we're striving for tonight. And in Zoom, so when you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you should have reactions. So if you click on that, you should be able to give either a thumbs up or a wave. So when you are done answering, you can put a thumbs up, and then we'll move along. Cool. I like the words here: introspection, discernment, new perspectives, tools, reflection. Cool. So I think it's really nice that we have a smaller group here, and I think we should be able to do all of this. And I think you'll like some of the other intro questions, because that'll help with the connection piece too. And the more you guys, the more we make this into a bit of a discussion, the more you get that connection to other coaches. So very cool. Okay, so this is our sort of formal icebreaker. Would you rather, I love doing these, would you rather be quarantined with either a chef who cooks amazing food or a musician who can play all your favorite songs? Doesn't matter the instrument. Maybe they play guitar, maybe they play piano, doesn't matter to me, but who would you rather be quarantined with? All right. Some chefs. Oh, more chefs than musicians. Okay, so then the next one is why? Why'd you pick what you picked? And you can put more than one answer in on this as well. Because food. Nice. Chef is more valuable. All right. Cool. I like sort of seeing the different reasons. I know some people consider themselves already a chef, so then maybe that's less valuable to them. All right. So thanks for participating in the first few. And we'll just sort of dive into the topic now. So before we do that, thoughts on using Mentee Meter and sort of having little things pop up on the screen. Give me a thumbs up if you're liking it. If you are not sharing your video, you can also chat into the chat box, share what you think. All right, so we're talking about self-talk tonight, and this is essentially all the stuff that we say to ourselves in our own heads, right? And that our athletes are saying to themselves in their own heads. It's our thoughts, right? And I think on the topic of self-talk, people hear or have heard a lot of different things, and primarily, you know, that it should all be positive, you know, always sort of promoting positive thinking. But I'd love to hear from you guys, like, what are some of the things, this can be more of a discussion, so I'd love for you to unmute yourself and for us to hear what are some of the things that you've already heard as far as self-talk, just so I can get a sense of sort of, are we new to the topic? Have you heard a lot of things? So feel free to unmute yourself, even if you're not on video.
I think I'm new to the topic, generally speaking, Tina. I guess it will be based on what more definitions or parameters you kind of put around it. But yeah, I like the concept of what I was hearing about tonight, so I'll learn more.
Okay, cool. So Sean's new to it. Alex, what about you?
I've taught it a little bit in Coach 1 courses, but not so much new, but when I was first introduced to it as an athlete, the biggest thing I found was when you do the self-talk, doing it in front of a mirror so that you are not just talking out loud to yourself, but that you are talking to yourself quite literally.
Right, okay, yeah. Sort of like affirmations and having a more explicit conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
We're all talking to ourselves all the time, generally,
Exactly.
right? But then it's less explicit for sure. Cool. Yeah. Peter, you don't have your video on, but I'm gonna ask, what do you know about self-talk so far, or like how new or how much exposure do you have to it? Or do you have audio? Maybe not. Okay, we'll skip Peter. Renee, would you mind unmuting yourself and fill us in on what you've heard so far? No. Okay. Well, I'll leave that open if you guys want to, again, put it in the chat box. It'd be really helpful just for sort of guiding the session if you have lots or less information on it. But we'll just sort of assume that everyone's sort of coming at it from a more or less beginner's perspective. So like I mentioned, again, self-talk is really all the things that we're saying in our head. And one thing that happens really, really commonly for human beings, partly because it's easy, is that we default to these always or never statements. So we do these for ourselves. We do these for the people who are closest to us. We do these for situations. So when we say them for ourselves, it's like, oh, I always mess that up. Or how come I can never figure that out? Right? And it doesn't have to have the word always or never in it. It can be sort of implied of like, I can't handle my emotions, right? Or I'm really good at that. It sort of implies that I'm always really good at that, or that I can never handle my emotions, right? even though we're not saying it and we're not being explicit about it, we're sort of leaning in that direction, and our brain interprets it in that way of like, well, this is just who I am. This is never going to change, or this is just how the situation is. And a really important thing, especially right now, human beings do best when they feel that they're in control. I'm sure you've all heard this before, right? That we want to be in control, or at least feel like we're in control. We also want to know that things can change, and that we can sort of be a part of that change. So when things feel stuck, when things feel like they can't change and we can't control them, that sort of feels the worst. And when things don't feel great, but at least we know that they can change and we can maybe have some control over that, then that feels better, even in a bad situation. So part of why I wanted to talk about this particular topic is that right now it's so easy to get into these sort of statements in our own head. And I thought it would be helpful to start sort of calling some of them out and making them explicit, and then sort of running through strategies for tweaking them. So that if there's something that you're telling yourself that is making you feel like, if we imagine that neutral is 0 and the things that we say that make us feel really good are like +10, and the things that we say to ourselves that make us feel really bad are -10, like maybe there's something you're telling yourself that feels like -8, and maybe we can offer something that's going to make it feel like a -2, or even like a 0, or maybe even a +2. Maybe we can even flip it around and actually make it feel all right rather than feeling not so great. So I'm going to pull up Mentee again, and this one is going to be just sort of getting a sense of what sort of statements are going around either in your head, or maybe you've heard these from your athletes, maybe you've heard these from people in conversations. So what are some of the things that they're saying, or that you have noticed yourself thinking about? And again, this is all anonymous, so it's sort of a nice way to do it, to just sort of see what's on people's minds, what are some of the things that are coming up. So you can go to mentee.com, and then if you still have it open, it should just go to the next question. But if you haven't logged in yet, then you just put that code in, and you can type in as many answers as you want. So you can sort of do one, submit it, do the next one, submit it. So we'll leave this up for a minute or two, just so that people can get a few in here. I'm seeing some common ones. And whenever you're done, even if you don't have your video on, if you can go to your reactions and just put the thumbs up to show like, yeah, I'm good, I'm not throwing any other suggestions in there. Kirsty's good. Yeah, so a lot of these seem pretty skill-based, right? And sort of thinking about, they sound almost like you would hear these things in practices or in games. I wasn't sure if I was going to see more things sort of related to things that are unfolding, of like, I'm never going to be able to play my sport again, or this is always going to suck, like I'm never going to have motivation for this again, or something like very specific to what's happening, or these are a little more general and probably related to when you guys were training, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. I'll give it another 10 seconds in case, because I just saw a few more pop in. So. Okay, cool. So thanks for putting those in. And, oh yeah, I see. Thanks, Jerry. So yeah, like all of our athletes, well, and even, so you'll start noticing all of the always and never absolute statements that I use when I'm talking. It's something that we have to be constantly aware of using a lot of, or very few, or sort of these extra words, because what they do is they actually create hope for people, right? Where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe the odds aren't in our favor. However, it's still possible for this to happen, right? So I'll give you an example just of something that I used to think was like an always for me of, or like a never of like, I could never control my emotions, right? And that was something that I honestly believed about myself for many, many years. And I just sort of caught it a few years ago, and I was like, I've known about this information for a long time, but this one seems to have flown under the radar. And then just becoming aware of it, it was like, okay, how can I change my language around this? Is it true that 100% of the time I cannot control my emotions? Right? And that is one of the most helpful questions that you can ask if you hear an athlete or you catch yourself thinking in these absolute terms. Is that true 100% of the time? There's never been one occasion where this has not happened. That's where you want to start. You don't want to tell them necessarily, oh, I bet this doesn't happen 100% of the time. There's probably one time, right? You want to ask them the question. You want them to come up with the answer. You want them to ask themselves the question when you're not around. Okay, so this is one tip when it comes to trying to influence how they talk to themselves, is to ask questions more than to tell them what to say. Ask them questions so that they generate an answer because they believe their voice in their head more than they believe anyone else. So if you can ask a question where they come up with the answer of like, actually, yeah, it's not 100% of the time, versus you trying to convince them that it doesn't happen 100% of the time, they're way more likely to believe that and actually carry that belief forward with them of like, yeah, you're right, it's not 100% of the time. Then you want to start to build a belief that, even if it is 99% of the time that this thing is happening and only 1% of the time that it's not, then your next question is like, how do we turn that 1% into 2%? How do we turn 2% into 5%? How do we turn 5% into 10% of the time? And how do we make sure that, a couple of years from now, when you're in the biggest events, of your career, or sort of depending on where they are, maybe that's a few months from now, but how do we make sure when you're in that event that we expand the number of times that you're getting it the way you want it to be, or you're thinking the thoughts that you want to have, or shrink the thoughts that you don't want to have. I think it's more helpful for a lot of athletes to think about, how do I have this positive thought more often and expand it, rather than how do I suppress the negative thought? Because trying to suppress a negative thought and get rid of it usually doesn't work very well. Usually it just sort of like comes full force at you like a bigger wave, right? And you guys have probably heard this example before, but I love it, of like, if I say don't picture a pink elephant, instantly you do, right? Like you're like, oh crap, no, I'm not supposed to, right? So it's sort of the same idea if you're like, hey, don't mess up. Like, don't say the wrong thing. You're thinking about saying the wrong thing. You're thinking about messing up. And that's actually not the most helpful thing that you could be thinking about in that moment, right? We want to flip the perspective around of like, hey, what do I want to be saying right now? Or what do I want to happen before I take this shot? What do I need to focus on, right? So depending on what sport you're coaching, like if you're coaching basketball, it might be like, okay, if I'm about to take a free throw, like what do I need to be thinking about? Honestly, sometimes it's not very much. It's just like, hey, where are my feet? How many times do I bounce the ball? And then I take the shot. Like I actually don't want to be thinking that much in that moment, right? Versus Alex, like you were sort of saying in life-saving, I'm not sure if there's like, if you want people going through the different acronyms of like steps that they need to go through.
Yes and no, depends on the event, but yeah.
yeah, like it might be like, okay, survey the scene. Like you might want them to sort of like, okay, focus on these things when you show up, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and then sometimes they just need to respond, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Different events call for different skills in those regards, but yeah, there's all of those skills get utilized at some point.
Yeah, totally. So with this, again, we're trying to sort of make them doubt their own doubts. And for yourself, for your own absolute statements about like, oh, I'll never get that job, or I would never have a chance at that, or like our team will never do this, or we always this. Do you always, or have you just a lot of the time in the past done that, right? Do you never have a shot at that, or is it just a slim shot, right? And so putting that tiny bit of doubt is actually a really positive thing. And again, so the first thing is to ask a question. Is that 100% guaranteed, right? And if your athlete can sort of come back to you with even one example, then you're like, perfect. I bet there's more where that came from. And even if you can't think of them right now, that's okay. We already know this doesn't happen 100% of the time. And we're going to work on how to get that to happen, like what you want to happen more often, right? So the next step in that process is once they've realized, you know, the one or two times where the thing that they're concerned about, oh, I can't get this skill, or let's take a skill. I can never get this skill. Once you go, well, what about that one time? You actually got it pretty good that one time, right? Yeah, okay, there's a lot of times where you haven't gotten it well, but you know, what was happening during that one time when it did go well? You want them to start reflecting on like, what is working for them? What are the characteristics? Were they calm? Were they amped up? You know, or were they somewhere in between? And how did their energy level sort of impact that? You know, was there a lot of people around, not very many people around, and how did that maybe play a role? Were they tired or well rested, and how did that impact things? You know, when had they eaten last? Like all these sort of little details, you want to sort of get them to realize like, oh, all of these things contribute a little bit to the performance that I'm seeing, or, you know, what's happening. And if I can tweak even a few of those, I'm going to put the odds in my favor that I'm going to get that good outcome more often, right? So if, let's say, you know, in a life-saving example, you know, I get called on, I think of like when I go and do my first aid recertifications, they're like, okay, we need one person to like be the CPR demonstrator. And you're like, okay. And now the whole class is watching you, and they're like, so you're like, okay, what are my counts again? And like, you know, and if you think of like, when did that go well? You might be like, oh, well, maybe it went well when I wasn't focused on like all the people who were watching me, and I was just focused on like, what would I actually do to help this person? Okay, so that's important for me to remember, you know, if I want that a good result more often, right? That for me, the focus needs to be on the person that I'm helping, right? Or if I'm in a game and I notice like, actually the crowd really helps me. You know, we don't always have big crowds, but maybe I can imagine a crowd. Maybe I can, before I take the shot, imagine what that big game feels like, or what it could feel like, right? And sort of create that environment so that we can make that good result happen more often. So really, when it comes to these absolute statements, again, the first thing is you have to break the absolute. You have to point out that there's very few things in life that are 100%. Very few. There probably are. You know, it's sort of like saying never say never. There are times when you can say never. However, those are fewer and further between. There are a lot of situations where things are more gray. They're not quite so black and white, right? So first you have to make it gray instead of making it black and white. Then again, start asking questions that allow them to figure out, how do I get more of the good result? Even the one time that I got it, or the two times that I had a good result, how do I get more of that? What were the environmental, either the things outside of me or the things in my head that were happening that were helping me get that result? And I don't control all of those, but which pieces of those do I control? Okay. For those who have joined in a little bit later, welcome. And I'll put the invite out again. If you want to throw your video on and unmute yourself, feel free to. I think it makes it more fun when we've got more video, but you're welcome to also just listen in. And so we'll continue on. So some of the statements, like a lot of them were around skills. What I want to know is, have you guys heard either from your athletes or someone close to you sort of these always or never statements around like sort of personality traits, usually personality traits that they don't like about themselves? Those of you who are unmuted, you can feel free to or who are muted, feel free to unmute yourself and pop in here.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so like, I guess the one that I mentioned earlier around like, oh, I can't handle my emotions would be one that almost felt like a personality trait, right? Or like, oh, I always get angry, or I'm always nervous. It's one that I hear a lot from a lot of athletes. So they're sort of, rather than about a skill of like, I can't figure out the skill, it's like sort of something that I feel all the time, or something that I do or perceive all the time. Does that help?
A little bit.
A little bit?
A little bit. Anyone else, feel free to tag in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen any of my athletes say that to me personally, but I've seen it through a mission of statement, meaning that I've seen it do it through body language. So every time maybe like they do something that they're not comfortable with, or something that they haven't done yet, they get down on themselves, the shoulders drop or their head drops. Not necessarily a statement, it's more usually related to a skill acquisition. And I've always tried to say, we don't use the word can't when I'm in the gym. Something we haven't done yet, right? It's not something you maybe never done it before, but it's not something you can't do. It's a new skill. It's maybe something that you just haven't practiced enough, or maybe the coaching point that another coach hasn't really kind of pushed you on, and so you're in a new environment. And so for me, it's the mentality that hopefully helps change that. So I haven't gotten to the point where I've had athletes kind of come down on themselves with things about like personal traits, than more about skill acquisition. But I do see it in their body language, because like the shoulders will drop or their head will drop, things like that.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, is that, yeah, it's not always going to be verbalized to you. Sometimes it will, like if you're like, how are you feeling right now? And they're like, oh, I always fill in the blank. Or, but yeah, sometimes the body language will be sort of the hint that you get at this. And even there, right, like depending on sort of the flow of your practice or sort of what the context is, if you have time either in that moment or after that moment, after a practice, to sort of pull that person aside and be like, hey, I noticed, when you were working on this thing, when your shoulders slump, it sort of makes me assume that you feel like you're never going to get this skill. Is that true? And they might be like, yeah, I've been trying it so many times, I just can't get it, right? And so then you're sort of, we want to sort of confirm if that assumption is correct, because that might not be what was going on. It could be something else entirely, right? So you want to just say like, here's the behavior that I saw, here's what I assumed, is that correct? And if it is, then that's sort of where you can get into that question of like, okay, like I totally understand why you're feeling that way. I know there have been quite a few misses, and so it makes sense that you feel discouraged right now. But again, like, has this been 100% of the time, or has this just been 100% of the time so far? So I like that you brought that up, Sean, of like, that word yet is super, super helpful, right? Like, just because we haven't gotten it yet doesn't mean we never will. And so the next tip is to ask them, or either share a story of your own of something that you thought you would never get, or you thought was always going to happen, and then it didn't happen, or then it did, right? Something that, so you might share a story of your own and then ask for one of theirs. So like, oh, I thought I'll give one of mine. So when I was practicing, I have practiced yoga since I was like 19, 20. So it's been 12 years or so. And I never thought I'd be able to get a handstand. I was like, I'd see other people do it and I practiced it a lot against the wall. And I was like, oh, I'm never gonna be able to get in the middle of the room. Right. And there was one summer that I was practicing a lot, and eventually we were sort of outside in a park. So I think just sort of the lighthearted play aspect of it made it easier. And plus I put a lot of time into it, but you know, then I sort of got it, and it was sort of fun that it got on video too, that someone was filming it and it was like proof, proof that I got it for at least a few seconds. Right. So even to have a little anecdote, something in your back pocket that you can pull out and be like, here's a story of mine, what's something of yours? Because again, the second that they can come up with that thought in their own head of like, actually, here's something for me that, you know, whether it's sport related or not, you know, it could be something in school, it could be something with a friend, someone they thought would never talk to them and then they did, or, you know, they'd never be able to cook that thing at home and then they did, like any sort of belief that they used to have that was broken, right? So the more stories you can sort of pull out of them of that, the more they go, oh yeah, like just because it feels like it's never going to happen or it feels like it's always going to be this way, you know, here's a whole bunch of examples from my own life and here's an example from your life that sort of show that things do change. So that's sort of the second or third, depending on how you're listing things. Then the last piece that I want to address, because I do want to keep this sort of as concise as possible, is that when things change, they don't change all at once. And a lot of young people have this sense that like they're going to learn something and then it's just going to be great. And I can't really blame them, because when they watch stuff online, it looks great. They only see it when it looks great. And so they see the finished product. They don't see the hours and hours. You know, every once in a while they might see a highlight reel of like the bloopers, but it doesn't really give them a sense of how much time someone's putting into their craft before they show you what's going on in their gym, in their sport, and whatever they're doing, right? So this is the last piece, is that if things are going to change, we're going to notice them changing in 3 ways. So one is that the frequency of something is going to change. Okay, so either something that you like happening happens more often, or something that you really don't like happening happens less often. So out of 10 competitions, if 9 out of 10 you got super nervous, now it's 7 out of 10, right? 3 out of 10 competitions you did not get super nervous, right? That shows progress. So even though there's still 7 where you did, right, we're showing progress by the frequency changing. Okay. The other way that we're going to show progress is the duration of something changing, or how long something lasts. So for the nerves example, let's say I have a big competition coming up. Maybe for one athlete, they get nervous like 2 weeks before that competition. Like they're already sick, they can't eat, they can't sleep, they can hardly talk to you anymore, right? So you'll know that progress is being made, not because suddenly they're not nervous at all, but because they only get nervous a week before the event now, or now it's only like 2 or 3 days before the event, right? So it always has to be based off of their normal. So someone who gets nervous 2 weeks out, you can't expect them to just get over it in 10 seconds and like not be nervous at all, right? That's going to be a process for that person, potentially over a few months, potentially over a few years, to close that up, so that maybe it's only like, at some point, it's only 5 minutes before their event. Then the last way that we're going to notice something is changing is the intensity of it changing. So they go to an event, maybe they're still nervous for 2 weeks, but instead of it feeling like a 10 out of 10 nerves, it's like a 5 out of 10 nerves, right? Where it's like they can still eat food. You know, yeah, maybe their sleep isn't the greatest, but they're still getting to sleep at the right hour. They're still waking up at the right hour. They're still socializing at, you know, mostly a normal level. Like it's not an obvious sort of nerves, right? So we don't have to have all of these things changing, but even just one of those things changing, so the frequency, how often things are happening, the duration, how long things are lasting, or the intensity, how big it feels or how little it feels. Those all give us an indication that someone's getting better at something as well. So the reason this is helpful, again, is that someone has sort of these always or these never statements, is that it's not going to go from like, I never am able to do this, to suddenly I'm always able to do this, right? It is going to be like 2% of the time I can do this, and now 5% of the time I can do this, and now 10% of the time, right? So that's the frequency changing. Or that my skill, like maybe the mistakes that I'm making, instead of being a massive mistake, they're much smaller mistakes. Now we're just getting real picky, right? So the intensity of that mistake is sort of changing. Or again, the duration, like how long am I thrown after a mistake? You know, does it take me 10 minutes to get over it, or can I get over it in 5 or in 2 or in 10 seconds, you know, before the next play starts? So I'll sort of leave it at that, because I wanted to keep this a short and sweet session. But I do know that many of us are on mute, so I'm going to pull up Mentee once more, and I want to find out from you guys, like, what's the takeaway from this session? So I'll pull this up for the last one. So for those of you who joined us later, again, you can just go on the screen that it says mentee.com, so you can go there on your smartphone and put the code in. And I just want to see, and this is like open-ended answers, so what is your biggest takeaway or lesson from tonight? What's the thing that you're either going to apply, or was a really great reminder, or something that you can bring to your athletes? And I'd like for all of us to put at least one thing in, so that would mean we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 answers. I won't put one in. So we'll hopefully get all 9 responses in there. And these will sort of fill in as people put them in. Cool. We'll give it maybe another 30 seconds or so for the last couple to roll in. Awesome. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I know we went a little bit over the half hour, but hopefully, even if you didn't type something into Mentee, hopefully you got something out of the session this evening. And I'm not in a rush to head out, so if anyone wants to hang out on the call after and ask any questions in a smaller group, there's no problem with that. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evening, and hopefully you attend more of the sessions in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Tina. Like Tina said, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute or write something in the chat box.
Oh, I see Sherry had a question about an athlete who is quick to respond defensively or emotionally, and sometimes confrontational, usually due to insecurity. Sherry, are you asking if that, sorry. If that is due to insecurity or a lack of confidence? Yes. That it really depends on context. It's, you know, sort of the responses that we get from athletes, from people in general, like if it's very quick or defensive, sometimes it's just that they haven't actually been taught another way to respond, that nobody has sort of pointed out what that response you know, that they are being quick to respond. So part of it could be, you know, if we think of like skill versus will, it could be skill. It could be that, you know, if we sort of point out like, hey, I noticed that, you know, you're answering fairly quickly and it sounds like you're being pretty defensive. Did you notice that? You know, again, always depends on the context, but that might be a bit of a light bulb moment for them of like, oh, no, I didn't recognize that that was happening. And sort of giving them tips for how they can respond rather than react. If it's something that comes up very, very often for that person, it could be sort of, you know, pulling them aside and having a one-on-one conversation or two-on-one conversation with someone else there of just like, hey, we've noticed this is sort of a pattern. One thing that can be really helpful is to even just count to 5 or count to 10 before having your response or taking a deep breath, you know, something that allows them to pause before they respond. So if that's something, if you have someone that you work with who is very, very quick to fire back, I would recommend probably the first thing is to gracefully make them aware of it. Assume that they don't know that they're doing it. Because there's a lot of things that we do that we're just not really aware of, especially if they're younger, but really at all ages this happens. And then to give them some sort of a strategy to pause before responding and work with them. Because again, it's not like you're going to say that once and then suddenly they're going to be perfect at it. We have to apply this frequency, intensity, duration to that as well, that, you know, more often than not, after you've had this conversation, you want to see that sometimes they are taking that deep breath before they respond. Or that, you know, when they take that deep breath, yeah, maybe they are still worked up when they respond, but, you know, the intensity of sort of how they're confronting you has come down a bit, right? And you can even sort of highlight that to them of like, hey, I feel like this is working because even though you're still worked up, you're not as worked up as you used to be. So that's progress, right? Because it's going to feel, especially if they are confrontational, it's going to feel big to them, right? That's part of why it's showing up as confrontation. Yeah, thank you for the question. Did that sort of answer what you were looking for? I think so. Okay. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions or thoughts that you guys want to throw out to help each other? Because with coach socialization, it's really great for each of you to hear from one another because you all have experience in your different sports.
I'd be curious on learning a little bit more on what Alex referenced at the beginning of the call, just with regards to having athletes or even individual coaches with regards to this looking in the mirror, talking to yourself, kind of having like some steps that I guess take place. I'm not familiar with that, but kind of piqued my interest when I heard Alex mention that.
Yeah, Alex, do you actually want to share with us what you heard about that? And then I'll just maybe fill in any blanks if there are any.
Okay. So when I first became a life-saving sport athlete back in 2012, let's say, my coach at the time got us to do a lot of mental preparation, and a lot of hers was guided meditation and guiding us through specific events on key points of it. So we were going to surf nationals down in Halifax, and one of the big things that she guided us through was making sure that we could do our board race or our ski race, and how we would picture not just key points, but the feel of the sand, the feel of the wind, the feel of the water, what to expect. And in that mental preparation, knowing what we were about to go into, not just, oh crap, the water's going to be freezing, but when you get into that water, how are you going to react with it? And then when we talk about positive self-talk, instead of just saying things like, I am capable of sprinting this quick, or I am capable of reaching that goal, instead of just saying it, sitting in front of yourself, making the eye contact and taking it a little bit more seriously to talk to yourself, rather than as, how am I phrasing this without screwing it up? rather than just outwardly putting it out into the universe, directing it at yourself so that you're engaging with the side of you that's doubting everything that you're about to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It goes hand in hand with a skill that we teach around giving the voice in your head a name. For a lot of athletes, this is really, really helpful because often, it's sort of like we mentioned at the start of the session, they believe that voice in their head, whatever it says, whether it's like, you suck, you can't do this, you'll never figure it out, you always do this, whatever it is, right? But the second they give it a name of like, my brain's trying to convince me that I suck. My brain's trying to convince me that I'm not going to be able to do this. My brain's trying to convince me that this is going to be really hard, right? That what it does is it separates them from their thought, right? And it allows them to look at that and be a little more critical of it and decide whether they want to believe it or not. And so even like you're saying, Alex, like when I say that statement to myself in the mirror and I look myself in the eye, right? It's like I'm having a conversation with another person. It's a little more convincing than just having the thought in my head. Like, sure, I can do this, right? But when I look myself in the eye, I'm like, I can do this. Hey, you've got this. You've done this before, or like whatever it is, right? That it's much more, brings up more emotion, it brings up more connection to that statement. And yeah, on the flip side, like if you don't want more emotion and connection to that statement, sort of separating yourself from it and being able to look at it and be like, I don't know if I actually believe that thing, right? Like sometimes athletes like to pick a funny name of like, I don't know, Gertrude is trying to convince me that just because my first shot didn't go in, that my second shot won't either. You know, then sometimes it just lightens the mood for them as well of like, okay, Gertrude, like just because I didn't make the first one doesn't mean I can't make the second one. So there's sort of like little tricks like that too, that separating ourselves from our thoughts for the ones that we don't like so much, or when you're working on an affirmation of like either writing it down is more engaging than just thinking it, or looking at yourself in the mirror is more engaging than writing it down even. So those are sort of ways to connect to that positive affirmation a little bit more. Thanks for sharing that. I like that. Any other questions from anyone else tuning in? You can type it into the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself as well. Okay, it looks like we're all feeling pretty content. So again, hopefully you all have at least one takeaway, if not more. And you know, if after the session you have things pop into your head, I'm sure you can find me online and send me an email. But otherwise, we will wrap up the session. So thanks so much for participating and tuning in.
Great. Thanks so much, Tina. Yeah, that was great. Lots of takeaways from my end. I know my athletes will definitely love that whole nicknaming your inside or your other thoughts, I guess. Gertrude's a good one. Yeah, so thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for attending tonight. Just so you're all aware, our next session is tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. with Travis. He'll be running us through kind of like a example workout of what you can be doing at home. And this can be valuable for your athletes as well. And then on Thursday, we have another session about how to monitor your athletes. And then next week we have 4 more sessions. So definitely keep an eye out. We now have all of the events on the locker and on our social media. So keep an eye out for those sessions and come out as much as you can. I also wanted to bring attention to a couple of things going on in Nova Scotia right now. For those coaches that are living in Nova Scotia, we are offering free NCCP home studies for multi-sport programs. So definitely take advantage of those. You can find those on our website. Or just email me at comcoach@cscatlantic.ca and I can point you in the right direction. But if you do have any downtime, now is a great time to take advantage of those free NCCP home studies. And we also have our Support for Sport VIP program that I encourage all of you to sign up for. And through that, you also get some free safe sport training, and which includes make ethical decisions, commit to kids, and respect in sport. So a great time during the time of isolation to get those courses complete and become a VIP coach. So if you do have any more questions about future presentations or about tonight, you can email me at comcoach@cscatlantic.ca. But thank you for joining. And if you want to rewatch this will be posted on YouTube. So feel free to share with your athletes or coaches. a home study. So essentially it would be like at your own pace. Someone would provide you with the materials. It'd be kind of like you're doing school at home. So you're given a textbook, you're given like a workbook, and you complete it and then pass it in to be marked. So you'd be completing like your NCCP course that you would usually be like 8 hours in a classroom. You'd be completing it at home at your own pace.
Sweet.
Yeah. Good question.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks again to Tina. And again, reach out with any questions or feedback about the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thanks for participating. See you guys.
Thanks, Tina.